Welcome back to Diane Noah. If you have been following global geopolitics recently, you already know the Middle East is on fire. But what is unfolding with Iran right now goes far beyond anything this region has witnessed in modern history. This is not just a war, this is the systematic, accelerating unraveling of a regime from the inside out, from the top down, and from every direction at once. Today, we walk through the full picture, the open rift between Iran's government and its own military, the supreme leader secretly flown to Moscow on a Russian military jet, the obliteration of Iran's underground infrastructure, the fracture between its two armed forces, and the three catastrophic scenarios that could define or end Iran as we know it. Stay with me. The ceasefire contradiction. Let's begin with a question put to an Iranian official at a press conference, and the answer that triggered everything. Has Iran asked for a ceasefire? The response was cold and immediate. No, we have never asked for a ceasefire. We have never even asked for negotiation. And yet, almost simultaneously, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stepped forward with a completely different message. He announced Tehran welcomes any initiative that brings the war to a complete end, adding that diplomatic relations with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and neighboring countries remain fully intact. Now pause, let that sit. One voice says, "We intend to win," another says, "We are ready to talk." These are not two different countries. These are two wings of the same government, publicly, openly, catastrophically contradicting each other. This is not normal political disagreement. This is a visible, audible fracture running through the very foundation of the Iranian state. And when the foundation cracks, the building begins to fall. As the war enters its third week, something unprecedented has emerged from Tehran. A signal so historically significant it will shake the foundations of modern Middle Eastern politics for generations. In every practical sense, it is a white flag. The conditions attached to it are deeply revealing. The end of the war is contingent upon guarantees hostilities will not be repeated and the payment of compensation. In plain diplomatic language, we lost, but we want an honorable exit. The deeper story is this. Iran hadn't just lost a military battle, it had lost the entire region. By striking civilian airports, hotels, and Gulf infrastructure completely unrelated to the conflict, Iran alienated every neighboring country simultaneously. The Gulf states were furious. The neighborhood Tehran needed to survive had become the neighborhood that despised it. And rather than saving Iran, this desperate overture toward peace only accelerated the fire already burning inside. The split that cannot be controlled, because while the foreign minister extended an olive branch, the military delivered a completely different message through its own channels. Sources close to IRGC Commander Hussein Salami were explicit. IRGC operations are continuing at full speed. The defense of Hormuz, Karg Island, and the underground tunnels is active. A ceasefire can only be discussed after the enemy has surrendered, not a single moment before. The foreign minister says peace. The military says war. The civilian government has lost control of its own armed forces. Political analysts call this the military fighting on its own, a condition where political leadership has collapsed and the military operates as a self-directing force. In the entire history of modern nation-states, this scenario almost never ends without catastrophe. But to understand why this happened, you need to understand one specific event, one wound, one absence. The missing supreme leader. Mujtaba Khamenei was elected supreme leader on March 8th and 9th, following his father's death. He was the new apex of the most powerful institution in Iran, the man supposed to hold everything together, and then he was struck. During the airstrikes on Tehran, he was wounded. When Iran's own medical infrastructure proved inadequate, a decision was made at the highest level. He was secretly transported out of Iran on a Russian military aircraft flown to Moscow at Vladimir Putin's personal request. Let that land, the supreme leader of Iran, the single most powerful figure in the Islamic Republic, lying in a hospital bed in Moscow, wounded, absent, unable to command. While Mujtaba lies in Moscow, the Iranian state is functionally split in two. Government operates without supreme authority. Military operates without supreme authority, both pulling in opposite directions with nothing left to hold them together. This is the real reason Gulf analysts and Turkey's foreign ministry are sending urgent warnings through back-channel diplomacy. A power vacuum exists at the very top. And history teaches one consistent lesson about power vacuums: chaos always rushes in. Trump, Karg Island, and the statement that shocked the world. Washington has taken full notice. Trump acknowledged Iran is signaling desire for ceasefire talks, but made clear he sees no reason to rush. His words were direct: "I don't know that I want to make a deal. The terms aren't good enough yet." Then came the statement that stopped observers cold. Referring to the March 14th operation on Karg Island, "We completely leveled a large part of the island, but we could strike a few more times just for fun." For those unfamiliar, Karg Island handles 90% of Iran's total oil exports, more than 2 million barrels daily. It is not merely a military target, it is the economic beating heart of Iran. On March 14th, U.S. forces struck military depots, mine stockpiles, and IRGC installations using B-52 bombers and cruise missiles. The island has been completely devastated. Trump's message was unmistakable: "We can come back anytime we choose." The hardliners refuse to yield. Here is where Iran's internal crisis becomes truly dangerous. Because Iran's ideological hardliners, men who built their entire identity around the doctrine of resistance, are not accepting defeat. They are enraged. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf was unambiguous: "We are not seeking a ceasefire. We will strike back at the aggressor." Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Garibabadi rejected all diplomatic engagement. "There is no room for negotiation. There are no ceasefire talks at this time." And then senior official Mohsen Razi delivered perhaps the most extraordinary statement of this entire conflict: "The war will only end when the United States pays full compensation and completely withdraws from the Persian Gulf. We will decide when the war ends." Think about what is being said. Iran's air defenses are gone. Underground infrastructure is rubble. The supreme leader is in a Moscow hospital. The economy hemorrhages $3 to $4 billion every single day. The regular army is fracturing, and yet officials demand America pay compensation and vacate the entire Persian Gulf. This is the language of men who have lost connection to reality, or men desperately performing strength for a domestic audience that is already beginning to understand how much has been lost. First question for you. And this brings me to the first question I want to put directly to you. When a government publicly calls for peace, while its military publicly calls for war, and when officials make demands bearing no relationship to reality on the ground, at what point does a government stop being a functioning government? Has Iran already crossed that line? Is it still a state in any meaningful sense? Serious analysts genuinely disagree on this. Drop your answer in the comments. This is exactly the kind of question that deserves a real conversation. The UAE accusation and the diplomatic gambit. While internal chaos raged, Foreign Minister Araghchi attempted a calculated diversion, redirecting attention away from Iran's collapse and toward its neighbors. He made an explosive claim. The HIMARS rocket attacks on Iranian territory were launched from the soil of the United Arab Emirates. Iranian forces tracked the trajectory and confirmed rockets were fired from two distinct UAE locations. The logic was clear: legitimize Iran's attacks on Gulf infrastructure, drive a wedge through the coalition by poisoning the UAE-US relationship. But Tehran could not produce verifiable evidence. The accusation landed in a diplomatic environment already deeply hostile to Iran and only deepened Tehran's isolation further. Leadership vacuum, ongoing American strikes, the systematic loss of every strategic advantage. Iran had maneuvered itself into a corner with no exit. Operation Epic Fury and the destruction of underground Iran. And then came the blow that stripped away Iran's greatest source of strategic confidence, the infrastructure it had spent decades building. For years, Iran invested massively in underground military architecture. Missile cities buried beneath mountains. Nuclear command bunkers hidden kilometers underground. An entire parallel military structure designed to survive any surface-level strike. Operation Epic Fury ended that era in days. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers armed with 13-ton bunker-busting bombs targeted the missile cities and command bunkers beneath Karamabad and Isfahan and reduced them to rubble. B-1B Lancers from the United Kingdom crushed underground storage across multiple sites. B-52s set a record, more than 2,000 strikes in 100 hours. Iran's asymmetric power, hidden underground for decades, could not escape American missiles even at several kilometers' depth. The underground cities collapsed. The infrastructure was gone. The sky was lost simultaneously. Between March 13th and 16th, Tehran's air raid sirens fell silent, not because the threat had passed, but because there were no radars left to detect it, no aircraft to scramble. Iran's F-14 fleet, maintained with pride for decades, was completely destroyed on the ground. Defense Secretary Hegseth confirmed it publicly. Air power is gone. The defense industry is 90% destroyed. Iran is fully exposed to aerial attack from any direction at any time. Israel targets the streets. The devastation extended beyond military installations. Between March 11th and 14th, Israeli drones systematically targeted Basij and Artesh checkpoints across Tehran, Karaj, and Shiraz. The barricades and armored vehicles positioned to intimidate Iran's own population, the physical symbols of state control on the streets, were destroyed from the air one by one. Israel deliberately released footage of these strikes. The intended audience was not foreign governments, it was the Iranian people. A direct demonstration that the regime is so militarily hollow, it cannot protect a single checkpoint in its own capital. The state can no longer control the streets it spent decades terrorizing. That is psychological warfare at the highest level. The Ukrainian shield. Iran's final asymmetric advantage, its drone warfare capability, was being dismantled as well. Between March 10th and 13th, Ukrainian anti-drone experts and FPV combat operators, with President Zelensky's personal authorization, deployed into the Gulf region and to U.S. military installations. Ukraine, fighting for its own survival, sent its most battle-hardened drone warfare specialists to defend the Gulf against Iran's Shahed drones. They achieved a 96% interception rate. Tehran had spent years threatening to burn the region. That threat has been reduced to empty noise, not just by American bombers, but by Ukrainian technology forged on an entirely different battlefield. Iran's asymmetric doctrine has been neutralized. The economic collapse. The economic picture compounds every military failure simultaneously. Oil exports have halted completely. Karg Island is heavily damaged. Refineries are burning. The Strait of Hormuz is closed to U.S. and allied shipping. Here is the brutal irony. The closure of Hormuz, Iran's most powerful economic lever for decades, is also blocking Iran's own exports. Every day the strait remains closed. Iran bleeds $3 to $4 billion. China's energy supply chain has been disrupted, and Beijing is quietly furious. Despite Irakchi insisting Russia and China remain full military allies, the reality is stark. China's concrete military support has been zero. Russia is consumed by Ukraine. Iran is fighting this war alone, isolated, militarily destroyed, and economically collapsing. The army fractures from within. This cascading devastation is triggering a breakdown within the Artesh, Iran's regular military, unlike anything previously observed. Soldiers are abandoning posts and returning home, citing solidarity with the people. Logistical support to IRGC units is being refused by Artesh commanders. Officers are openly asking, why should we sacrifice our soldiers for this war? During evacuations of the wounded, physical clashes have broken out between Artesh and IRGC personnel. Hundreds of junior officers have deserted. Messages circulate among the officer corps. We defend the homeland, not the regime. The Artesh traces its lineage to the Shah's era, built around national defense and institutional hierarchy. The IRGC is the ideological armed wing of the Islamic Revolution, existing to defend the revolution's ideology and project it beyond Iran's borders. For decades, this rivalry was managed, controlled from above by the supreme leader's authority. Khamenei is dead. Mujtaba is in Moscow. There is no authority remaining. The managed competition of decades has become open-armed conflict. Second question for you. Which brings me to the second question I want you to think about. If the Artesh fully turns against the IRGC in open conflict, what happens to the millions of Iranian civilians already living under economic collapse, aerial bombardment, and constant fear? In a country where two armed forces are fighting each other, who is left to protect the ordinary people? This is the question keeping analysts awake at night. It has no comfortable answer. Write it in the comments. Let's have that conversation properly. 3 scenarios for Iran's future. Against this backdrop, a missing supreme leader, a military split in half, an economy hemorrhaging billions daily, and infrastructure reduced to rubble, Iran now stands at the edge of 3 distinct and deeply dangerous scenarios. The first scenario is the IRGC military takeover. Signal intelligence suggests the IRGC is planning to blockade key government ministries and communication centers in Tehran, purging pro-peace figures including President Pezeshkian and Foreign Minister Arakchi. State rationality gives way to a militarist doctrine placing ideological survival above all human cost. But this scenario contains its own destruction. The IRGC would continue a war with every supply line severed, no air defenses, and no capacity to sustain regional conflict. Sanctions strangle resupply. Soldiers walk home. The population faces starvation. This path leads not to victory, but to grinding attrition, ending in total disintegration. The second scenario is a forced ceasefire under international pressure. Secret diplomatic traffic under Gulf mediation confirms this remains alive. Iraqi's statements already point toward accepting the Trump administration's conditions: full dismantling of the nuclear program, withdrawal from the Strait of Hormuz, and heavy financial compensation. These conditions would permanently strip Iran of its identity as a regional power, and the moment they are signed, the IRGC's entire narrative, decades of sacrifice built on resistance, evaporates. Radical factions turn weapons inward against the officials who signed. The ceasefire ending the external war becomes the spark igniting civil war at home. The third scenario, and by every measure the most dangerous, is simultaneous collapse. Neither the military nor the civilian government maintains control. The regime fragments from within while destruction continues from outside, each process accelerating the other. The loss or assassination of Mujtaba Khamenei, absent in Moscow, deepens the power vacuum beyond recovery. When tension between the Artesh and the IRGC escalates into sustained open-armed conflict, the backbone of the Iranian state shatters. This is not merely a change of government. This is the physical fragmentation of Iran as a territorial entity. Ethnic fault lines suppressed for decades activate. Resistance movements rise in Kurdistan, Sistan, Baluchistan, and Khuzestan. Civilians exhausted by hunger pour into the streets. The IRGC, torn apart internally, cannot suppress what follows. And the devastation radiates far beyond Iran. Russia's most significant regional ally burns in civil war, crippling Putin's southern strategic flank. Iran's withdrawal from the arms supply chain deepens Russia's logistical crisis in Ukraine. The entire axis of resistance, the arc from Tehran through Baghdad and Damascus to Lebanon, collapses simultaneously at every point along that arc. The conclusion. In the simplest terms, the regime is giving up, but the war is not over, because the regime is no longer a coherent entity capable of giving up in any organized way. It is fragmented, divided against itself, leaderless, a structure being struck from outside and disintegrating from inside simultaneously, each process feeding the other. Iran has lost. The question is no longer whether it can win. That was answered days ago. The questions that now define the next chapter of history are: how will Iran collapse? How quickly, and what shape emerges from the wreckage when the dust settles? This is one of the most significant geopolitical inflection points of our generation, unfolding in real time. The consequences will be felt across the Middle East, Central Asia, and global energy markets for years, possibly decades, ahead. That is exactly why this channel exists. To cut through the noise, to lay out the full picture without simplification or agenda, to give you the analysis that actually matters when the world is moving this fast. If this is the kind of content you want more of, honest, in-depth geopolitical breakdowns on events reshaping our world, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell right now. Every new analysis drops the moment something major happens, and these are not stories you want to arrive late to. And before you go, two big questions. When a government and its military publicly contradict each other this openly, has the state already ceased to function? And if the Artesh fully turns against the IRGC with civilians caught between them, who bears that cost? Write your thoughts in the comments. No matter which side of the debate you are on, every perspective adds something real here. I go through the comments on every upload. This channel is built on those discussions. Until next time, stay sharp, stay informed, and I will see you in the next one.